recording, you may turn off your cameras. And if there are no objections, we can begin. All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning from Oxford. Good afternoon to our colleagues in Asia, and good day to those who will be watching this session recording on YouTube. I am Marco Zaplan from the Gov Data Initiative. I also sit as co-chair of the implementation working group of the Open Data Charter, and I will be moderating today's very exciting virtual session titled Open Data for Climate Resilience. So, as many of you may know, we celebrated Earth Day last April 22, Wednesday. Happy Earth Day, everyone. Unfortunately, the world's ecosystems today have been experiencing long-term significant shifts in global and regional weather patterns and average temperatures due to climate change. So to mitigate and adapt to these changes, we need timely, accessible, and interoperable data to inform strategies, disaster preparedness, adaptation planning, and more importantly, national climate action plans. So this session explores how open data principles can strengthen climate resilience across four dimensions. And these are greenhouse gas emissions transparency, climate finance tracking, disaster risk reduction, and adaptation planning. So we are very lucky today to have four speakers from three amazing organizations leading the work on these issues. Each organization will be given 15 minutes to present their work, experience, and hopefully practical recommendations for our colleagues in government, industry, civil society, and development partners to consider. If time permits, we will have a short Q&A later in the session. So please save your questions for later, or you may leave them in the chat box. So to jumpstart today's conversation, we have Sebastian Sahla. He is a senior policy manager at the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative International Secretariat. And today he will talk about how the EITI is providing a tool for climate action in resource-rich countries. The floor is yours, Sebastian.
Thanks very much, Marco. Yeah, and very nice to meet you all, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I'm usually based so the EITI International Secretariat is in Oslo in Norway. I am usually based in Scotland, but to add another dimension of complexity, I'm dialing in from Munich in Germany today. So very nice to see you all. And yeah, as Marco was saying, I'm just going to share my screen quickly. But as Marco was saying, I want to present to you how the EITI can play a role in providing data that can drive climate action in the extractive sector. And there's really three key messages I'd like you to take away from the presentation. The first, perhaps a slightly obvious point, but it is a reminder that the extractive sector, so there we're talking about oil, gas, and mining, is a major contributor globally to climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. The second key message is that the global efforts to tackle climate change and to advance the energy transition have really significant implications for the countries that host oil, gas, and mining industries. And it presents some important opportunities for those countries, but also some quite serious challenges. And then the third key point is that the EITI can provide data that can help to inform evidence-based policymaking on those on climate action in the extractive sector to help to ensure that resource-rich countries navigate the opportunities and challenges that this presents in an inclusive and accountable manner. Now, to take us very briefly back to the sort of the basics, and I won't go into the details here, but is this reminder that the extractive sector is a really significant source of emissions globally. And the extractive sector contributes to emissions in two really important ways. I mean, one is just the emissions that are generated directly through extractive operations. So, for instance, through the fuel that gets consumed by the vehicles and the machinery that are used to operate mines. That's sort of one type of emission. But then, of course, when we're speaking about the fossil fuel sector and the extraction of oil, gas, and coal, the much more significant role that the extractive sector plays in global emissions are the emissions associated with what happens when those resources are consumed by end users and the combustion of those fossil fuels and the contribution of that to global greenhouse gas emissions. And I've pulled up just two charts from WRI here that sort of help to illustrate how significant the contribution of the energy sector and basically the consumption of fossil fuels is to global greenhouse gas emissions. That's sort of the inner circle in those charts. But then on the chart on the right, you can also see in the outer circle some little slices. This is very hard to read, but of to help kind of illustrate actually in terms of the direct emissions from extractive operations. You've got a little slice here for non-ferrous metals mining. You've got a slice for non-metallic minerals for iron and steel. Just to give you a picture of kind of where the extractive industries sit in the global contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, as we're all aware, there are lots of efforts underway globally to tackle climate change and to move us from an economy that's primarily dependent on fossil fuels to one that is increasingly able to rely on low carbon alternatives. I think in the last few years, there was perhaps a slight loss in momentum behind those initiatives because of some of the political changes we've seen around the world. I would anticipate that we're going to see this accelerate again in light of the crisis in the Middle East and the implications that's had for energy supplies in lots of countries around the world, not least the Philippines. But the global move away from fossil fuels has really important implications for countries that host oil, gas, and mining industries. And I've kind of categorized these around three different dimensions. One, a really important one, of course, are the environmental implications. All of this is being driven by the imperative of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in order to tackle climate change. So that's a really important positive environmental contribution that the energy transition makes. There are also positive environmental impacts related, for instance, to the improvements of air quality if you stop burning coal, but also some potential environmental challenges. For instance, if communities are left with the legacies of past industrial activity and the environmental damage that those might have caused without them being properly remediated. Another set of implications are the economic implications of the energy transition. So particularly in countries that rely very heavily economically on these industries, the energy transition can present some real challenges and present some risks to the public finances of those countries. We actually just produced a report a couple of months ago at the EITI called From Resources to Revenues, which I can drop in the chat later. But it looks at the exposure of different countries economically to the energy transition. And certainly there are some anxieties in fossil fuel producing countries around the long-term economic sustainability and the implications of the energy transition to that. Conversely, in countries that produce the minerals that are used in low carbon technologies, the energy transition is actually potentially an opportunity to attract new investment and generate new forms of government revenue. And then all of this also has societal implications. In fossil fuel producing areas, in coal mining areas, for example, there might be concerns around job losses. But then again, in areas that are seeing a growth in mining to respond to the demands of the energy transition for minerals, you might see impacts on traditional livelihoods, but also new job creation in the mining industry. The kind of the basic message here is that the implications of the energy transition for resource-rich countries are really nuanced and complex, but they're certainly significant. And we need good data to be able to understand those implications and then navigate those in a responsible and accountable way. And that's really where we see the EITI coming in. The EITI, for those of you who don't know us, we're a global multi-stakeholder initiative that promotes information disclosure in oil, gas, and mining. There's something called the EITI standard, and it sets out a set of requirements around the types of information that governments and companies need to disclose to the public. And then it also creates requirements for governments, companies, and civil society to sit together to scrutinize that information in order for that to be to inform policy making in the extractive sector. And the ultimate aim really is for that data and the multi-stakeholder dialogue to promote more open and accountable management of oil, gas, and mineral resources. We think the EITI has a really important role to play in the energy transition because it can provide data that can shed light on how the energy transition is impacting the extractive sector. And the hope is that this can allow countries to maximize potential opportunities and mitigate potential risks. But I'd also say that the role of the EITI is not to tell countries what sorts of policies to pursue, or even whether to pursue any energy transition policies at all, but rather just to provide the framework for ensuring that data is disclosed to the public and that there are spaces for multi-stakeholder dialogue that can ensure that countries are able to understand the impacts of the energy transition and then make well-informed policy choices that are aligned with long-term public interests. Um, and here, this kind of creates a bit of a picture of all the different types of data that gets disclosed through the EITI. It really goes very much from the starting point of the legal framework that governs the extractive sector to how licenses are issued, to how revenues are collected, all the way to how the sectors ultimately impact society and the economy. And right at the bottom of the slide, I've pulled out examples of some of the disclosures that are particularly relevant for energy transition planning and climate action in the extractive sector. I'm not going to read all of them out, but I think some of the ones I want to draw your attention to are provisions around the disclosure of energy transition policies, commitments, and plans, around carbon pricing mechanisms, around subsidies, encouragements for state-owned enterprises to disclose how they consider climate risk in their investment decisions. We have an encouragement within the EITI standard for companies to disclose greenhouse gas emissions through the EITI, and where possible to disaggregate those at a project level. And then moving along, there's also information on revenue forecasts and taking into consideration how climate change and climate risk might impact the viability of government revenues in the long term, as well as information on the local level impacts of the energy transition on the environment, on workers, on society. Taken together, we think this is a really useful framework for shedding light on the different ways in which the energy transition might impact a country. And this is here to illustrate how that might work in practice. So through government policies on the energy transition, you want to make sure that those are informed by solid data so that you can understand what the implications are of those policies for the extractive industries and ultimately then what that means for the countries that host those industries. And the implications might be, for instance, that it has some sort of impact on the amount of revenue that the country collects from the extractive sector. It might have an impact on jobs and on communities. Really importantly, of course, you'd expect these policies to have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions associated with the sector, but also on things like licensing decisions, whether a country decides to issue more licenses to companies in the extractive sector, or whether that might be at odds with its energy transition policies and its commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, to wrap us up, I just want to share a couple of quick case studies on how countries have used the EITI for climate action and energy transition in practice. The first one of those is Trinidad and Tobago, which is a major gas exporter. And they became several years ago the first country to use the EITI as a mechanism for reporting on greenhouse gas emissions. Initially, it was just one company that did that. It was the state-owned gas company that started disclosing its emissions through the EITI. Very quickly, that process gathered momentum. And I think at the latest, it was 10 or 12 companies that started reporting their emissions voluntarily through the EITI. That has now reached a point where the government is considering introducing policy changes to mandate greenhouse gas emissions disclosure from major polluters. So I think it's a nice example of how a kind of a voluntary reporting mechanism can ultimately lead to kind of sectoral change and policy change in a country. In Nigeria, also some interesting work on emissions being done through the EITI. Nigeria has big ambitions to grow its gas sector. They see that as an opportunity to generate power domestically. But that potentially sits at odds with the country's climate goals. And so the EITI, in collaboration with some partners like NRGI, has taken steps to advance emissions reporting and specifically to advance methane reporting. because there are big issues with methane emissions in Nigeria's gas sector. And that data is being used now to help shape policy on how to approach emissions cuts and specifically methane emissions cuts in Nigeria's gas sector. And then the final case study takes a little bit of a different angle to these issues and kind of zooms down to the very local level. We've, over the last few years, been doing work in Colombia, Ghana, and Indonesia through a project called Engaging Communities in a Just Transition, where we've been looking at how the energy transition impacts communities that live next to mining and energy projects, and trying to understand to what extent those communities face obstacles to accessing data and being able to participate in decision making. And we've been working across a range of different contexts. So in Colombia, we're working in areas that have historically hosted coal mining. That coal mining is winding down, and now those areas are seeing big renewables investments. In Ghana, working in areas that host oil and gas industries, and in Indonesia, working in areas that host nickel mining. And while those are really diverse contexts, we are consistently seeing that communities are demanding more information on how those industries impact their lives through jobs, through local revenues, through environmental impacts, and a demand to be able to engage with companies and government on those impacts and on the decisions that are impacting people's lives. We found that typically existing mechanisms for disclosing data and for creating spaces for dialogue aren't really fit for purpose. And so through this project, we've been exploring options for strengthening the EITI's role of disseminating information at the very local level and creating spaces for multi-stakeholder dialogue. And we see that as a really important component of making sure that these discussions around energy transition and climate action don't remain just at the national or even global level, but also that the local level implications of them are well understood and managed. I'd encourage you all to take a look at our website where there are lots of more resources on our energy transition work. And with that, I'll close for now and very happy to answer any questions later on in the session. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Sebastian, for your insightful presentation. So a round of applause, please, for Sebastian. So Sebastian shared to us an overview of how different the impacts are of the energy transition to different countries and how international standards such as the EITI, which is very close to my heart, can help institutionalize collecting and publication of climate data, which I think is very important to make sure that we even have data to begin with. Thank you, Seb. And now we move on to our next presenters from the Climate Policy Initiative. We have Tinglu Zhang. She's a data analyst at CPI, and Pauline Baudry. She's a senior design associate at CPI. They will present CPI's Net Zero Finance Tracker, leveraging data to accelerate the financial sector's climate transition. The floor is yours, Tinglu and Pauline.
Thank you, Marco. And hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. So yeah, we're going to be doing a bit of a dual presentation. Tinglu's in the data team. I myself am on the design and data viz team. So we thought it'd be quite a complementary view in what we'll present today. So I'll just share my screen. We've prepared a few slides. Hopefully that looks okay for everyone. So yeah, maybe just to start off, we just wanted to do a quick presentation of Climate Policy Initiative and who we are. So CPI is a nonprofit. We're an advisory group with a specialty in climate finance and climate policy. So a lot of our work will be around financial data with that focus on climate. So you'll see one of the examples we'll be presenting today. Our audience is quite broad in the sense that we sort of aim to help both public, private sector, ranging from governments, businesses, but also financial institutions, always with this aim to help driving economic growth while addressing climate change, essentially. So in our teams, we have experts on these topics with researchers and analysts, as well as on the data side. CPI is a very global organization, so we have offices around the world. Tinglu and I are both based in London, but we have colleagues in the US, in India, in Indonesia, in South Africa, and Brazil. So our work is covers sort of this global base, but I would also mention that the topics that we cover are also quite broad. Today we'll be focusing on one project, the Net Zero Finance Tracker, but I encourage you to also go look at the CPI website because there might be quite a few other topics that you might find interesting for you as well. I'll pass it on to Tinglu to talk us through the NZFT.
Thanks, Pauline. And now I will introduce a little bit of the our Net Zero Finance Tracker. And next slide. So NZFT is one of the main outputs of our financial institutions work streams. NZFT is an interactive platform. As you can see, that it provides the most comprehensive assessments of financial institutions' climate transition. So it aims to first inform decision makers on where transition and impacts are happening and where action is needed. It will also fill in a gap in data and disclosure ecosystem. So existing initiatives mostly focusing on covering specific actions or specific financial actors, and we aim to bring more comprehensive coverage by integrating them in our system. And next slide. So how do we inform stakeholders in the space? So for example, Net Zero Finance Tracker, it will shows regulators how financial institutions in their jurisdictions fare versus others, and helps them identify gaps in action and policy levers to address them. Financial institutions can instead measure their response against net zero alignment benchmarks, as well as other institutions to inform their internal strategy. And next, we will look, next slide. We will look more into how we build this tool, and which is where I mostly contributed in. So how NZFT is built. The NZFT combines both we called secondary data and primary data, and we cover more than 600 variables. Secondary data comes from third-party providers, assessments, and disclosure initiatives across the sustainable finance ecosystem. We have data from more than 50 data providers. Most data comes from public sources and retrieved directly from published reports, and other come through data agreements, like 17 so far with the actors mapped in this slide, for example, CDP, PRI, Share Action, and MSCI. And next slide, we also have primary data, which comes directly from financial institutions' own reports, including annual reports, climate reports, and transition plan disclosures, etc. That primary data is processed through a large language model-enabled pipeline that extract relevant information in a structured and scalable way. And next slide. So the financial institution's progress is then measured using 17 indicators across 3 dimensions, showing how they move from high quality targets like mitigation or investment goals through robust implementation actions like appropriate governance, risk management, and strategy, and to meaningful impact in the real economy, like investment deployment to clean energy and exposure to physical climate risks. And next slide. Targets and implementation indicators are scored from no action to best practice by benchmarking them against existing net zero frameworks. Impact indicators are instead all quantitative and presented as they are. For example, carbon dioxide equivalent or dollar amounts to clean energy, and benchmarked where possible against decarbonization pathways. And next slide, we talk about so So this is the coverage of Net Zero Finance Tracker. NZFT tracks 1,050 financial institutions, including key players across investor categories, like asset managers, asset owners, banks representing more than $280 trillion in asset managed or owned, or 60% of the global financial systems. And next, I will pass to Pauline to share our data dashboard.
Thank you. Thanks, Tinglu. So now that we've presented a little bit like how more about the data and how we get it, how we process it, I just wanted to like also cover a little bit more about the data dashboard itself and the website. So how we effectively make sure that this data is the most accessible and has the most impact that we aim for it to have. So I will walk through sort of like three key like guiding principles or frameworks that we found. The first one I would say is I think you would have understood the data that we work with is very broad. In a way, it's quite complex. We have 3 dimensions, 17 indicators, each of which will have different filters, different views. So it's very important that we make sure our information architecture is as clear as possible. For a user who lands on the website for the first time, we'll need to guide them through a little bit and make sure that everything's quite clear. So we have ways of doing that also visually, the use of color, but also the way we structure our content and how it displays on different devices. So to give a bit more detail about this, I mentioned the color system. So the Net Zero Finance Tracker is actually a framework, a tool, and a report that we update annually. And last year, we spent a bit more time redesigning the platform, and we spent also some time thinking about the color system and how we can use it as a visual aid to help users navigate through the platform. So here it's like a bit random screenshots from the website, but you'll see like the 3 dimensions: impact, implementation, and targets. Each have their own color. So whenever you're on the website, you'll know which dimension you're looking at quite easily just by using this color reference. The layout as well is important in the structure. So you can sort of see here visually the hierarchy where you'll have the 3 dimensions at the top, and then you can drill down into the indicators, and then the indicators themselves will also have different views. So here in this image, you can see project level financing, and you'll see there's a toggle. So here we're showing the amount in USD, in millions of USD of fossil fuels, transition, and clean energy investments. And it's a direct view, but you have the opportunity to switch and look at the indirect investments. And of course, all the filters as well on the sides, which some of which will be global filters, which will apply throughout indicators as you navigate through, whereas others will also be specific to the chart. So it's quite a lot of information, but we're like doing our best to make sure it's structured in a way where the user sort of knows how to navigate it. And I thought I would also mention, mobile responsiveness is also something that's important in terms of accessibility. A lot of the work we do at CPI is often more like desktop first, let's say, and it's also something we see in our analytics. People will mainly be using those on their laptops, but it's important that everything still is responsive and can be accessed through tablets or mobile, as I think it's important to make sure everyone can have access to this valuable information. The second point I wanted to share is also that, like being able to leverage the interactive nature of the dashboard is quite important for covering different needs that our audiences may have. So we mentioned our audience are financial institutions quite naturally, but also policymakers. And there will be researchers, academics. So I think there's quite like a breadth of people who are interested in this tool. And having those filters and sub-filters are quite important to allow for people to focus on the area that's interesting to them. So for instance, we'll have a regional focus, sectors, subsectors, whether financial institutions are part of coalitions and whether they have transition plans, for instance. And just wanted to show one example, but again, there are many. But for instance, I think something we found at least is that policymakers especially will not always be interested in the global view, but they'll maybe be interesting to drilling down in more regional places. So this is a screen recording. Hopefully you can see it. But here, for example, I'm clicking on regions and I have the ability to select multiple regions if I wanted to look at them, or I can select just one region and even drill down to the country level. So that'll be quite a different view and quite like targeted for what people want to do. And equally, another way to do it would be to go into the breakdown if you wanted to get a bit more contextualization of those regions. And if you click on regions here, you'll be able to like see the actual total value broken down by region as well. This is one example, but you can also have, you would have understood a lot of different use cases depending on what you want to do. And lastly, I think an important point also, I think, in this forum, which I thought would be interesting to address is, I guess, with this complexity and like the detail of the data that we have, we always have this bit of like challenge to have this balancing act between making sure we have an evidence-based approach. So I think we want to be as transparent as possible, but also making sure that we can provide digestible and actionable insights through the use of this platform, which is also why we work with scores, for example. But I wanted to show sort of how that kind of translates into three places that we have on the website. One is the data tables. The other are more like financial institutions level data views and driving actions behind our scores. So this is also just a screenshot from our data table where you'll see each financial institution and the different indicators, which you can also collapse and open in terms of the level of detail that you would want to have. There are hundreds of financial institutions. This is just one part of it. But essentially, I think what I wanted to show is we find it important to share that level of detail as a standalone element as well. But this is something you'll find under each chart in the dashboard. So if you filter through, this will also filter through the table. So I think that's quite an interesting way to make sure that whatever you're looking at, you can actually find out if you're interested and you want to know what that is, what that means in terms of the broken down data. Another example would be if you wanted to go even deeper. So we have these what we call institution data pages. So essentially, you can click on each of these financial institutions, and then you'll have the summary for that financial institution. Here it's a screenshot from one of them, looking specifically at implementation. So you'll find again all of these scores that you can see in the global views as well, like in the aggregated data sections. But specifically for that institution with a bit more information, contextual information, or the list of actions observed here, so a bit more like qualitative inputs as well. And again, I think this is something where we don't expect everyone to look into the hundreds of financial institutions, but it's important that it's there if it's relevant for the user, or if you also want to be able to just kind of have that sense check and like making sure you know where the data is coming from. And lastly, I also just wanted to mention this example around driving actions. So this is also a screen recording, but you can see here we're looking at the target dimension and specifically mitigation target. And this is the overview. There's no filters applied, but you can see how they score, if they're progressing, best practices, etc. And then you have this toggle view with driving actions, which we try to implement to kind of show what are these actions behind the scores. So I think that's also an interesting way in which the interactive nature of the website allows us to have different views associated to one indicator to make sure you have that like richness of information. And I think that is all for us. So thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you very much, Tinglu and Pauline, for your informative presentation. Again, a round of applause, please. Tinglu and Pauline shared to us about the importance of comprehensive data and user-friendly tools, emphasis on the user-friendly, in informing policies and decisions around climate finance for various stakeholders. The NZFT got me really excited, but it also reminded me about the significant amount of work needed to design such tools to make sure that they are not only specific, but also relevant to our target data users. Thank you again, Tinglu and Pauline. And now, from international standards and experience, we now go to a more specific and national context and learn how we can translate data to action. Our third organization and fourth speaker is Dr. Mahar Lagmay from the University of the Philippines Resilience Institute, who will present about how the Philippines translate hazard data into actionable information for communities and national adaptation planning. The floor is yours, Dr. Mahar.
Yes, just allow me to share my screen. Are you able to see it, Marco?
Yes, I can see. Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Okay, my talk is about open data for resilience. It will be about climate change and disaster risk reduction, our experience here in the Philippines. And I'd like to start by telling a story about a landslide that happened in 2006. It was a big landslide, roughly about 4.2 kilometers long, about 1.5 kilometers wide. And it's a little bit offset, but you can see the helicopter there. It's a Huey helicopter to give a scale to the landslide size. And that landslide buried a town called Ginsaogon with a quite large population. And it was buried under 30 meters of rubble. And you can see that populated area here marked as yellow, and that's called as the town of Ginsaogon. When the landslide happened, there were about more than 1,000 deaths. And actually, there were stories about possible survivors. There were text messages going around that there was a school where about more than 200 children were trapped. So there was a mad scramble to look for the possible survivors, mainly the children, who the search and rescue teams believe were still alive, at least at the start of the search and rescue operations. The search and rescue teams were composed of miners, the Philippine Army, the U.S. Navy. It was a 2,000-man strong team. Also, emergency teams coming from Spain, Malaysia, Indonesia. And it was really a big effort to look for those survivors. They were trying to look for the school using backhoes and trying to make use of expensive equipment, search and rescue equipment. But their efforts were in vain because of the sheer size of the landslide. There were no more landmarks, and it was just impossible because of the size to find the school. When we arrived there in that area to be able to help in the search and rescue efforts and also to do some forensics on what caused the disasters and the disaster and the lessons learned from the disaster, we found out that there was a GPS, 4 millimeter accuracy GPS point that was available from years back based on a research study done by some scientists. And that data point resided in one of the government agencies. So just to give you a scale of the size, the backhoes are that, and the yellow one is this one. And it was just practically impossible to find the school. So that data point was asked from the government, but it was not provided until the seventh day. And on the seventh day, it was just too late because the groundwater was rising and the search and rescue effort failed because there was no data point that was available when it was badly needed. The point here is that during emergencies, you don't know what kind of data point or information you would need. And as such, we believed, or that told us that open data is very critical for disaster risk reduction and also for a lot of other things, including our efforts on climate change. In that incident, there was only one survivor. It was a chicken found on the seventh day. The lone survivor unfortunately died because it was eaten by the army teams that found that chicken earlier that day. So that lesson on open data was very important. And in terms of the disaster risk reduction efforts of the country, I would be able to identify some of the landmark policies, starting from 2004, which includes the National Geohazards Mapping Program, the Hyogo Framework of Action, the Climate Change Act of the Philippines in 2009, the Disaster Risk Management Act of 2010, Open Government Partnership. That's very important. At least we find here 5 years after that incident in Ginsaogon, the landslide disaster, we find some efforts. And then some efforts on open data. And then we have the 2012 Nationwide Operational Assessment of Hazards, of which we are very much part of. This now resides in the University of the Philippines and known as the UP NOAA Center. So the list goes on. You can see some entries on open data. We have the Philippine Open Government Partnership as part of the National Action Plan. And we have some provisions on open data in the General Appropriations Act, which is part of the law. And then later on, we have the UP Diliman Open Data Policy, which is part of the policy of the University of the Philippines and currently ongoing for all of the campuses of the University of the Philippines system. We are trying to get this policy implemented. But we're at the last stages, or final stages of getting it approved by the Board of Regents of the University of the Philippines system. In terms of disasters in the Philippines, we have here a list starting from 1999. The upper part in the blue area are called disasters that were averted, and at the bottom of or below the black line are disasters. So we have the policies, RA 9729, which is the Climate Change Act, RA 10121. Then we have Project NOAA, of which we are very much involved in. Project NOAA was instrumental in creating this pre-disaster risk assessment in the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council as part of the pre-disaster risk assessment, which provides hazard-specific, area-focused, and time-bound warnings. That relied heavily on vital information that NOAA provided that were made accessible to all LGUs openly as open data sets. And then we can see from the top, from 2014, there were a lot of averted disasters all the way up to 2016. And then when Project NOAA was defunded, we again started to have disasters, and they are reflected below the black line from 2017 to 2018 and then 2020. Again, we're experiencing disasters. And in terms of the work or the collective efforts done by Filipinos, we can see that based on those policies, including, we believe, open data, it reduced the number of fatalities from an average prior to 2014 of about 1,250 deaths, and then it was reduced from 2014 onwards to about only 250 deaths per year on average. So that means that with good science, with good technologies, and opening the data sets, it's possible to achieve good results, including the lowering of fatalities in the Philippines due to disasters. And if we are to promote that kind of work, I would encourage everybody to read these two papers, Counterfactual Evidence on the Impacts of Operations Research on Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction Efforts, and to know more about NOAA, the Disseminating Near Real-Time Hazards Information and Flood Maps in the Philippines through WebGIS. In that website, you can download for free all of the shape files related to the various types of hazards on a national scale. That's a lot of data sets that are available or that were made available to the public. And we can see that in terms of activity of that website, we've had a lot of views, especially during typhoons. And we also had a lot of local government units downloading our data, the hazard maps in particular for landslides, storm surges, and floods that were used for their local development planning, such as the climate and disaster risk assessment for their DRR plans, and also mainstreamed into their comprehensive development plans and contingency plans. We've had a lot of efforts related to crowdsourcing and open data, and you can see here that prior to 2016, in the Open Street Mapping site, you can see only a few, about 534,000 structures that were mapped, and it eventually became 2.7 million by February 24, 2017. And you can see the mapping of the structures, the roads, the buildings, the residential houses greatly improved for the Philippines. And these were used for disaster risk reduction. If you want to find out more about that, there's a paper on that, UP NOAA in Building Resilient in a Resilient Philippines, Multi-Hazard and Risk Mapping for the Future. These are all crowdsourced efforts wherein data is shared, are shared. Those maps of the footprints of the residential houses and buildings can be seen in the NOAA website at noaa.up.edu.ph, so that you can or one can look at the hazards in relation to landmarks in their neighborhood as well as their house. In terms of the summary of the major lessons that we learned for DRR, we believe that open data is very important. We believe also that the use of probabilistic risk assessment to reflect climate change scenarios are very important. All the rest of the three bullets are included in the Sendai framework. I think we have to have a whole of society approach. We have to have climate change impacts included into the plans of the community, and that the warning should be hazard specific, area focused, and time bound. And in terms of planning for prevention and mitigation of disasters, planning is key. And that should be reflected in the community plans, such as the comprehensive plans, local disaster management plans, the public service continuity plans, and so on, including the investment plans. There are more than 30 plans that are required of each local government unit to craft. And the Project NOAA, as well as the UP Resilience Institute, helps the communities plan for them. And it's very important that when they do their plans, the plans must cut across all sectors, like agriculture, coastal, water, health, forestry, and so on. During COVID, which is a biohazard, the same thing would happen, that all sectors are affected. We were all affected, the education sector, the tourism sector. And we did write a policy note requiring open data sets for transparency in the government efforts to try to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. It's very important for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation that we have multidisciplinary efforts. It's also very important that we expand that to the social sciences. We need to understand the mindset, the psychology of the Filipino people. We must bring in the arts and the humanities for people or for the public to embrace the science. And it's also important that we bring the science and get it mainstream into the plans of the community, where we work with national government agencies, the non-government organizations, the local government units. And for this to really work, it's very important that we share the data, because by sharing data, we build trust and we can work together. It's difficult to communicate without trust. And with science, it's also imperative that we have data sets available to be able to replicate the science, the outputs of which are most often than not in the disaster risk reduction arena or topic. These outputs are dictated onto the people so that they follow. But it's very important that the science be transparent and replicable in order to be trustworthy. We actually wrote a paper on this. It's a book. It's just a small book, and it documents and it tries to clarify the key elements of open data for climate resilience and disaster risk reduction. And it actually tries to define what open data is, availability in digital format, amenability to intermix with other data sets, and freedom to use, reuse, and redistribute, as well as no conditions, especially in disaster risk reduction efforts and climate change adaptation efforts. A lesson which we learned the hard way during the Ginsaogon landslide disaster. We have an open government partnership program. It's the Philippine OGP. We look at it. We looked at this data set, this website before, about probably 4 years ago. There was a disaster and rehabilitation section, and other sectors as well as are represented are shown in that same website. But if we look at it, there's a dearth of data in that site, and we really hope that this expands, this grows to cover more data sets for disasters. There's I think one result for mapping. There's one result for the others. These are the data sets that are available, but there's much to be desired, really. When I accessed the same site today, I did not find any more the disaster section. Open data advances collaboration around key social challenges, provides effective public oversight of government activities, and supports innovation. This I got from the Open Data Charter. And because there's no transparency, there's no open data, it led to a very big flood control scandal where there were a lot of government funds that were used for ghost projects, hundreds of billions worth of pesos, and that's an ongoing scandal of which we are trying to solve and trying to rectify here in the Philippines, because we want more, at least in the Philippines, where we have better, where our voices are heard better. We're trying to get that University of the Philippines open data policy ongoing, are approved by the Board of Regents. If you want to learn more about the draft UP Open Data Policy of the University of the Philippines to serve as an example for the Philippines to get all of the data sets out of their silos, and so that people can work together, the communities can work together, scientists, for us to be able to do transdisciplinary work. It's important that we show this as an example for the rest of the country. And thank you very much for listening to the talk about the importance of open data for climate resilience and disaster risk reduction. Back to you. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Mahar, for your insightful presentation. Again, a round of applause, please. So, Dr. Mahar shared to us the critical role that open data tools such as Project NOAA, a multidisciplinary approach, and academic institutions play in climate action. We also learned about the importance of government plans, policies, and support to make sure that such a data ecosystem is sustained in the long run. So thank you again, Dr. Mahar. I
Thank you.
believe, thank you, sir. I believe we have some time for Q&A. So I would like to open the floor to our audience for questions. You may raise your hand or type your questions in the chat box. I believe we have one question in the chat box. Diogo, would you prefer reading the question, or I think this is addressed to Dr. Mahar? Yes, so if I may read the question, it reads, including the recent typhoon Sinlaku, the Philippines has been at the forefront of global climate change. How can other regions of the world learn and perhaps participate in climate disaster prevention and mitigation in the Philippines?
In the in the Philippines, um, well, the easiest way probably is to be able to discuss all of these articles that we have been producing. We've been trying to get the other communities to learn about our experiences here. The most simple one would be, if you're a Filipino, to discuss it with others, and if you have Filipino friends, discuss it with your Filipino friends so that they can discuss it with their families here in the Philippines. Because just talking about climate change and just talking about the information that are available, including, most importantly, the free data sets, the open data sets, that raises awareness, and disaster awareness is actually the first step towards disaster preparedness.
Thank you, Dr. Mahar. Maybe we can entertain one more question from the audience
Yeah,
before
but
we...
if you want to contact us, please do so. We have a website. Just Google UP Resilience Institute.
All right. Oh yes, we have a question from Paul.
Yeah, hi. So all of the information about financial investment and initiatives was new to me, and a great way of looking at it. I really related to Mahar's presentation about data helping respond to disasters. I was wondering if anybody across the whole forum has seen data around the growing cost of responding to disasters. So, I mean, the policy that people are most concerned about here is their insurance policy, because we've had a disaster every 8 days this year so far, in some part of the country. And I was, just wondering if anybody has seen data starting to emerge about the growing cost of responding, and whether or not the insurance companies are getting behind anything like that. Mhm. Or
Yeah.
does anyone see the value in doing that? I guess too. Or is there another way of tackling?
Maybe one of our speakers would like to share their experience.
I mean, it's definitely of interest. I think, to be honest, nothing like directly comes to mind specifically around that, but I'm sure, the work we do at CPI as well, it will touch upon it. So it'll be like embedded in a lot of reports that we do more generally about the costs in general. But I think, yeah, I wonder if there is like an open data portal specifically for that, but definitely would be interesting to know. But yeah, I don't have anything much more to contribute.
Yeah, I mean, likewise, unfortunately, I'm not aware of any existing data on this, but would agree that it would be super interesting and relevant if someone were to collect it.
Mm.
All right. Thank you for that sharing and question, Paul. So maybe to close our session, if I may ask our speakers very briefly, I believe Dr. Mahar has to leave. But for our remaining speakers, if you could see one thing change in the next 5 years about how open data is used for climate resilience, what would it be? Like, what are your hopes for the use of climate data in the future?
I think Sebastian has had to leave as well. So sorry, Pauline and Tinglu. You are in the hot seat for this one.
Yes.
I mean, I think it resonates with what we've been saying throughout today, but I think just, yeah, more transparency and accessibility in general to data, I think is key in order to advance. So that's probably what I would say.
You, Pauline, and maybe from Tinglu.
Yeah, I think, I agree with Pauline. More transparency, and also I like just like what Net Zero Finance Tracker is trying to do, we want to be as comprehensive as possible, like include all the target implementation and whether these are actually making impact. But Net Zero Finance Tracker is mainly focusing on the like private sector. We are tracking financial institutions, but also more on the public side. There will be more some work like this. I think that's also what CPI is trying to do. I think that will help both the policymakers to both inform the policymakers and also for both private and public institutions to like how to improve their work, how to put those things into actual actions and impact.
Right. Thank you so much for that insights, and to all our amazing speakers. Thank you very much Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's very engaging conversation. We from the Implementation Working Group of the Open Data Charter and the Gov Data Initiative would like to express our sincerest gratitude to you, our dear participants and our speakers, Sebastian, Pauline, Tinglu, and Dr. Mahar for sharing with us your expertise and experiences. We look forward to having you all again in future collaborations. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day and have a nice evening to some. We hope to see you again in our next session.
Yes, our next topic is interoperability and DPI. I've shared the action plan so that you can all have a look. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of the Friday, wherever you are. Thank you all.
Have a nice weekend, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.